Greetings, dear listeners. This week, intellectual historian Nils Gilman joined us on the show. Nils is an old friend of the pod and makes his living as editor-in-chief of the Berggruen Press and deputy editor of Noema magazine. We talked broadly about modern politics. What is it that populists understand that liberals don't? Why does nationalism seem to galvanize people while climate politics do not? Is it religion? Is it myths? Or is it just a question of charisma? We get through a lot. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show. Nils, you arrived in London just as, I think Europe had a bit of a conniption fit over the weekend over the national security strategy and what the Trump folks are saying about Europe. I feel like maybe that's as good, I think we talked about many different political things to talk about, but I feel like that's sort of on the news right now and will get us into a lot of sort of conversations about this. I guess, did you read it? I know these things don't matter. Fundamentally, they don't really matter, but at the same time, they're kind of like psychological documents. They tell us something about, what's going on in the mind, in this case of Michael Anton, but others as well. So I don't know, could you, what did you make of it? And if insofar as like you're looking at the reaction in Europe, like, what do you make of that also?
Yeah, I just got back to Europe today, so I haven't really had a chance to talk to a lot of people about it, but I did communicate, briefly with some friends and people I know here in Europe about it over the weekend, and they are indeed alarmed. In terms of whether documents like this matter, I do think that people, sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. These are the kinds of things that people get hired into the position of director of policy planning to write. I think in many cases, intellectuals who are in government are trying to systematize and sort of derive principles out of what is basically a set of, particularly with this administration, instinctual reactions to things and trying to see, is there a method to the madness? And this is the piece that I think is trying to define a method to the Trumpian madness. And that's sort of my take on it. If I go a little bit further than that, I think that this is actually a really interesting document in a kind of more historical, long-term historical sense. If you think about the history of American foreign relations from the earliest days of the Republic to the present day, there have always been two major strands of thinking. One of them is what might be called Atlanticism. And that's been the dominant form since 1941, basically, with the Atlantic Charter as kind of a symbolic moment in the summer of 1941. And then obviously with the creation of the UN system that is of institutions that provide for global governance such as it is. We've been in an Atlanticist moment really for the last 80 years. Obviously, the first Trump term, when he started proclaiming America first, was the beginning of a repudiation of that Atlanticist tradition. And I think it's worth spending a little bit of time thinking about what is the alternative to an Atlanticist position. The Atlanticists have always said that the opposite of us is isolationism, but that's actually not really the case. The dominant story of American foreign relations from George Washington until 1941 was really a story of what might, in contrast to Atlanticism, we could call Americanism instead. And there's sort of two broad ways that America has oriented itself towards Europe. One way, the Atlanticist way, is to see the United States as essentially a province, a partner of Europe. We are part of a unified Enlightenment project of democracy and, open trade and liberalism and projecting that all over the world. And yes, of course, there's little differences between one tradition, the French tradition, the American tradition, the British tradition, or what have you. But fundamentally, it's one tradition, and we're part of this larger community that spans the Atlantic. The Americanist tradition, by contrast, is really about turning its back away from Europe. And this goes back really to the earliest days of the Republic, or even before the Republic. When the Puritans arrive in America, they come to get away from Europe, right? And there are many waves of successive um, immigrants from Europe who are coming to America to get away from Europe and see America as fundamentally defined in contradistinction to Europe. And for people in that sort of foreign policy tradition, the orientation is towards the rest of the hemisphere, right? So you get things like the good neighbor policy under FDR. He was actually an Americanist before he became an Atlanticist, right? No American president traveled abroad while in office until 1906. That when Teddy Roosevelt went to the Panama Canal, the first president to ever
That's
travel
a
off the
that's
North American
wild.
continent. Right, it's wild, right? The first president to travel off the North American continent while in office was Woodrow Wilson when he goes to Paris in 1919 to help negotiate the post-war settlement from World War I. So that tradition is a very live one, and I think that's explicitly what's being revivified in this document, right? And so, the invocation of the Monroe Doctrine, the invocation of the tired, backward nature of the Europeans, all of this is part of a long tradition in American foreign relations.
There's so many ways to pull on that thread. Let me pull on one. Right. I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the whether it's Western Hemisphere versus the West more broadly. I guess is one way to think about it. Right. But it's you know the 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 how best to pull on this thread. On the one hand, what you've written a lot about, about global governance and the rest of that, and these ideas of norms and I guess a means of structuring the world, uh, is tied to, as you even I think alluded to right now, the Atlanticist project. And one thing that as I was reading the NSS, the National Security Strategy, yeah, it is kind of like it's conservative in the Lionel Trilling sense, like a series of irritable mental gestures in a lot of ways, but they're irritated at something real again. And just now, as you're talking about the Puritans, they're like irritated at a kind of um, statist approach, right? Ultimately, to a lot of these things and in the European sense, they're not upset about European states; they're upset about the European Union, which ultimately seems like the big boogeyman here. So, I mean, I don't know how to phrase that question. I mean, I assume you're very pro EU because the EU itself is sort of like a harbinger of like a bigger like global governance thing. I personally, I feel really conflicted about reading the national security strategy because I feel like there's a lot of anti-immigration, thinly veiled racism inside it too. But overall, I'm sympathetic to the idea of you know, and I'm a Europeanist. I love Europe, but I want some tough love. I think there's a lot wrong in Europe right now, so I'm not like wholly as upset by this document as I think some people are, or think I should be. I guess is what I'm getting at. How do you pick at that a little bit for me, or Sam, jump in if you want. Like,
No, why don't you go ahead? I've got a
yeah,
way to sharpen that in a second, but go ahead.
yeah,
Well, first of all, there's several things you mentioned there that I want to address. In terms of the European Union, I think you're absolutely right. The document is not hostile to European nations. It's hostile to the European Union. I think it's specifically hostile towards the idea that power struggles can all be resolved through rules, right? As opposed to expressions of raw power in one way or another, whether that's economic power or hard military power or so on. There's a much more, it's very deeply rooted in the idea that at the end of the day, power is a zero-sum game, and we're not going to make it nice by just coming up with a bunch of rules. That idea is totally at odds with what the European Union is all about. The European Union is entirely about figuring that these countries that are in the European Union that for centuries had horrible wars with each other can move past that history by just having a bunch of rules. And it's kind of the ultimate legalist fantasy of, fantasy, I say fantasy not because it's necessarily entirely false, but maybe the better word is dream. It's a legalist dream of overcoming conflict through process. Um, and that's, I think, just sort of very much at odds with, the ethos of the president of the United States, who's famously a transactional guy. As I say, I don't consider him particularly ideological. I think he has interests more than he has ideas or ideologies. And he's willing to compromise on those if he thinks he can get a deal done that is going to be beneficial for himself or for the country. And so I think that's really what's motivating the anti-EU animus on at a legal level. There's also a cultural level, which is the EU has championed multiculturalism of a sort that is really at odds with everything that the MAGA movement stands for, right? And so whether we call that racist or not, I think is debatable, but it's certainly the idea that there's integral cultures within countries that are worth defending. And that idea, in the case of America, is America first, but they're totally good with Hungary first or Poland first or Russia first also. And the idea of this document, I think, is to codify some of that. So, in terms of my own opinions about the European Union, I have mixed feelings about it too, Demir, to be totally honest. When I was young, I was more sympathetic to the project, but I've come around to the idea that the European Union is in fact completely, muscle bound with its regulatory approach, and also has been way too focused on economic integration, on the assumption that political integration would follow willy-nilly from economic integration. And that anticipation just hasn't panned out. And we're seeing a backlash against that, partly because the economic promises of the European Union just haven't panned out at the level that they were promised, certainly in the 1990s.
Okay, so to kind of sharpen a couple of these things philosophically, which is usually my role here on this fair podcast. So I have a philosopher colleague in Rome who works on Hayek. And I remember I was over for a symposium about Charles Taylor and communitarianism. And he was laughing about lots of things about Taylor. And then he said, the reason I've spent my career studying libertarians is because in Italy we have too much community. And then he talked about it, like all of these insane situations with his family and how much he wanted to, it's good to have family around, but like start distancing yourself, this kind of thing. I guess like my own sense, like one of the ways I think that one of the ongoing arguments that Demir and I have about this is whether I think we both agree that there's a breakdown of a kind of liberal internationalism that had ideals that Demir and I both consider to be quite naive, but I think we consider them naive maybe in opposite directions. I think your sense, Demir, I mean, you can fill in your own words, obviously, but I think you have a sense of like a kind of resident background barbarism that's coming back to the surface in these debates. Whereas I think my sense is that there is like an intrinsic sociality to humans that we're actually not doing justice to in some really, really key and important respects. And that the tension between, so part of the issue with that kind of like regulatory internationalism is that it's in some way like a kind of homogenizing principle that is just creating a universal norm without having any of the kind of like deeper tensions, difficulties, or ideals about the nature of life allowed to come to the surface in the right way. So, I mean, it'd be like, I guess like where the reason that, I mean, you and I were corresponding about other things, but then it was like, actually, it'd be really interesting to talk about this a little bit. I think that where the effect of this that I see is that there just isn't like a rejuvenating structure on the left right now. So what you see on the right is that you do have like ideals and like, whatever, like, I feel like a lot of Democrats that I talk to think that the left is kind of lacking intellectualism at the moment. My feeling is they actually have a pretty robust intellectual tradition that's showing up on the surface. And the thing that's surprising to me is actually the opposite, is how few like resources for moral rejuvenation we're seeing show up on the left side. So that's kind of like where, and so this question about like, is violence just coming back to the surface? Are we going to see some sort of actually vital, robust, rejuvenating moral convictional mechanisms showing up on the left side? So that's these are the thoughts that are like keeping me up at 3 a.m.
But just to then just keep us still on the European thing though, Sam, you think
do
that
we
the
do we
European,
have to?
No, but do you think the European thing is more coded left in this sort of thing because it's committed to a certain set of like, arguably of these sort of moral things, but it's a failure. I agree with Nils on this in a lot of ways, probably in harsher terms that Nils would say. I think it's a failure in very important ways because it doesn't take into account something else. I think you said it best there, Nils. Basically, politics. It doesn't. It assumes away politics in a way, or at least has a particularly naive version of it at its core. So, before we get into the left and rejuvenation, I'm just curious, Sam, if you think the European Union, and same to you, Nils, like whether the rejuvenated left project has anything to learn from the European Union, I guess is the way, and sort of the ideals that it's based on, which I think are largely hollow.
Um, I mean, there's a lot to say there. I uh, tend to be pretty careful and skeptical against those kinds of like liberal internationalist homogenizing structures, but sort of critiquing them from a moral valence rather than the other way, like
Yeah, yeah,
rather
no, I
than
get
just
that.
like pure barbarism. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
Nils, go ahead.
What do you guys think is missing? Is it a sense we've had a few words we've thrown out there? I mean, community, meaning, purpose. I think all of those are things that human beings need, crave. They find different ways to do that. Sometimes it's manifested through projects. Sometimes it's manifested through religion. I do think that, again, like you look at Europe today, among the old traditionally Christian populations, the amount of participation in religious institutions has fallen off a cliff. I mean, the mosques are full, but the churches are empty. Um, and I think that that is a symptom of, a little bit of Bobo's in paradise, if we can bring back that old phrase that from maybe 25 years ago, right? The idea that like we're just going to have a consumer culture and, we'll just go ahead and do all those things. And people, I think, feel when they don't have any headroom to advance economically, that those projects are not enough to give them a sense of purpose and meaning in life, and to feel excluded from those, the material benefits of that, and not even to have meaning on the other side, really gives people a sense of radical alienation. I do think that that's pretty pervasive in Europe, and actually, it's pretty pervasive a lot of places in the United States as well. I mean, obviously, religious life is more vibrant in the United States than it is in Europe. But you look at church going rates, and particularly among people who are sort of under 35, there is an absolute cratering happening in the United States too. I haven't looked enough at the data to know whether that's more on the left or the right or what's going on exactly with that. But those things are things where there has been an evacuation of connectivity to other people through the declining faith in institutions. So I do think that that's a big problem. And the European Union as a project is all about sort of trying to reinstitutionalize a certain kind of legalism and a certain kind of proceduralism without, as you say, I agree with both of you on this, without there being this kind of substrate of connection to the institutions, which is in some sense pre-political. So I do think that that's a big problem for the European Union.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. I guess that, just to throw another word in there, and the problem with all these words is that they are, it's how you define them that leads to all sorts of things. But the main problem for Europe, it seems to me, is that they've never been able to create an idea of sovereignty at the European level. I think the two attempts to do it are both unhappy. Napoleon and probably Hitler, right? Like are the two like precursors of a proper trans-European sovereignty, and always on the back of conquest in those cases. I mean, leaving Hitler aside, Napoleon would have perhaps, had he not gotten rolled back and had that somehow held, he would have left a kind of legal framework behind, and maybe the French Revolution could have stood for some kind of, ideals, and would have informed something, and maybe a European Union could have grown up along the side of the United States and developed a kind of sovereignty on the back of Napoleon's conquest if they've held. I don't know. That's a pretty wild assertion there, and I don't know if I buy it, but it's something I've thought of before.
I mean,
Um,
just one thing there, though. I mean, I do think that there are instances of significantly larger. I mean, there obviously are instances of significantly larger scale European political units. They just don't have the ideological conformity. So, like, even the Austro-Hungarians, like, they have like vast territorial expansion.
sure.
It's just it's not trying to be a kind of unified homogenous ideological project in the way that like Napoleon would have been.
Right. Well, but they had the emperor also, and
Yeah, the
that
emperors,
it was really important, and the symbolic sort of linkage of that, and it was coming apart at the end, right? Like, I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire didn't last, and it didn't last just because of the war. It fell apart for other reasons. So, I mean, I think, and I'd love to sort of drill into the religion part and the meaning stuff, and as we start talking about the left more broadly, but I just sort of put it here that like I wonder if the problem isn't just meaning structures like that, or whether the meaning structures are broader than that. I do think that there's something incredibly hollowing out about modernity, this consumer culture you've brought up, Nils, and this creates a yearning, and that yearning is for some kind of populism. I think is basically what it ends up amounting to, but it's yeah, like the so-called transnational hard right, whatever you want to call it, they've latched onto the nation state. And I don't think that's exactly right either. There's something about an ability to be sovereign over something that matters. I feel like the abundance bros think that like sovereignty will grow out of like competent technocracy. I don't think that's right either. Um, so I don't know. Let's kick that around a bit. Like, what are we talking about here? Like, what's missing?
Well, I think there's a bunch of different things we could probably point to about that. So first of all, I think there's been efforts to find a larger project or sense of meaning on the left. I think, and by the way, accusations from the right occur a lot on this ground. So specifically climate change as a kind of a global project where maybe we have a moral compunction to try to solve the problem of climate change. And there's all sorts of different variants of that religion. If you want to look at it that way, there's versions of it that say we need to put on the hair shirt and reduce our consumption. So that's sort of degrowth strategies. There are hyperabundance, technological accelerationist versions of that. These are the eco-modernists, right? So and whether we call that a religion or not,
Uh,
I don't know. We can have a debate about that. That's, as you say, probably to some extent a semantic question. But I do think that there's a sense that there needs to be a project, right? It can't just be about like we're all just going to go do our thing and watch MTV and not pay attention to anything else. I don't think that that's an adequate sense of meaning for really anybody. So on the right, maybe they think climate change is a hoax. Maybe they think it's a false god. I've been on the record for many years with looking at the way the right thinks about climate change and environmental challenges more directly. I think they use that as an excuse for reasserting national sovereignties in various ways. Say, we need to keep the immigrants out because the immigrants will become consumers like us. This was the Sierra Club's position into the 1990s, for example. In order to reduce the ecological footprint of humanity, let's keep people who are poor that way, right? There's all sorts of versions of that occur on the right, and that have basically an entirely cynical view of the left's attitude towards climate change and towards environmentalism more broadly. I don't personally know. I mean, I should just say I'm not a religiously musical person, to use the phrase that Karl Rove used to describe himself 20 years ago. So I think this is the first time I've ever compared myself to Karl Rove. But so
interesting times.
Indeed. I'm not a religiously musical person myself. I don't feel a lack in my life from not having that, not having some sort of a metaphysical lodestar that I'm orienting myself towards. But it's immediately socially apparent that many, many, many people, maybe certainly the majority, maybe the vast majority of people, do feel that kind of a need in their lives. And it would be foolish. It is foolish to just disregard that and not consider that we need to have people have a structured sense of meaning. Can that happen at a unit larger or sort of smaller than the Godhead, than the planet? I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of other, maybe the oldest religious traditions of humanity are animist ones that find, um, pan spiritual meaning in everything from the mountains to the streams to the fish to the rocks, right? And
to sharpen this a little bit, I mean, I think Demir might want to talk about just the political and the sort of role of violence in a second, but I I think one of the themes that we've talked about a lot here is whether what's happening is that um the like gradually developing in the 20th century, say the 90s paradigm was that um economic development and growth would effectively be that sort of immanentized religious framework. So you can have a society that doesn't have larger aspirations besides ongoing societal scale economic productivity, and that will then come down to individuals, and individuals will then be able to effectively have larger sphere of choice that they can exercise agency in, which so we don't have like large scale public narratives about what the meaning of life is, but we devolve that down to individualized meaning making structures, something like that. So like if you think opera is the most important thing, then you do that. If you think going to football games is the most important thing, then you do that. Like and I think part of what's going on is that idea of, and this is why I was like sort of pushing a little bit about like fundamental anthropology, like are humans intrinsically social, and if so, how does that work? Because I think part of what's going on is that version of the 90s version of the American dream, which is like, um, if no matter who you are, you can make it here, and you can expand your effective range of will via economic development for your individual life. And societally, we're doing that collectively, and that's why you should whatever adhere to this project. And I think the U.S. did that in one particular kind of way. I do think that the like reason that there's been so much emphasis in the EU on economic integration is basically like a kind of similar theory of life. And my sense is that's the thing that's breaking down. People are skeptical that version of like what counts as ideals isn't working.
I think that's right. If you go back to maybe the ur text from that 1990s moment that you're describing, which is Fukuyama's The End of History, both the
Yeah.
essay and the book, it's actually really, I don't know how many of your listeners have actually gone back and tried to read that recently. It's actually kind of a remarkable text. And one of the things that in the context of what you're bringing up here, Sam, I think is really important to emphasize is that Fukuyama himself notes that the end of history will be a sad time. That's his phrase
Yeah,
that he
it's
kind of
amazing. It's amazing. Yeah.
ends this essay on, right? Because all people will have to do is like, go to football games or go to opera, and there'll be no sense of heroism, no sense of glory, no sense of larger purpose.
I mean,
And
there's
he
this amazing
already,
passage. There's this
yeah,
amazing passage. You may be about to bring this up. Like I had a tweet go viral a couple weeks ago just because I like retweeted a screenshot of this. There's this passage where he's like, here's a great way to test the role of thumos in contemporary society. Let's think about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is like a real estate developer who thinks he's like winning at all these things, but then at the same time, it's like a very limited range of thumos, and it's not actually what like the old warriors were able to achieve. And it's super. I mean, Fukuyama is like really, really prescient about this.
100%. I mean, I think he's been denigrated really unfairly a lot, right? But that intellectual history aside, I do think you're right that there was this moment in the 1990s. And actually, we've been talking so far about the European Union version of this and the American version of this, but I think it's probably worth bringing up now the China version of this. Because the Chinese, particularly since Xi Jinping came into power, was it 13 years ago now, have been promoting this idea of the China dream, right? Which is obviously, on one hand, it's a very indigenous set of ideas, indigenous to China. On the other hand, it's explicitly echoing the American dream as a phrase. And I think that the Chinese, certainly to get rich is glorious, to quote a previous leader, right? Deng Xiaoping said to get rich is glorious. And when China's GDP per capita was $200, was $200 as it was in the late 70s, getting rich was obviously going to unlock a lot of personal liberty in all sorts of different ways, right? So the question is, there's a diminishing marginal returns, psychic returns to additional dollars. I think probably all of us know a lot of really rich people who aren't very happy. And I think as you go from $200 to $2,000 to $20,000 per capita, you're going to see a significant increase in happiness. When you go from $20,000 to $80,000 per capita, there's not a lot of evidence that people's happiness levels increase. And so that, I think, is already a tell. I think China's sort of reaching that plateau now where they're reaching the point where marginal dollar returns First of all, they're being hoarded in that country by elites in the same way it's happening in Europe and the United States. And second of all, the marginal psychic return to additional dollars is decreasing. And the way, of course, the Chinese deal with that is they have a massive system of information control, so that whenever narratives start to emerge that are really critical of the paucity of Chinese life, the spiritual life of Chinese, that stuff gets savagely repressed. We have exactly the opposite thing going on, particularly in North America, but also in Europe, where we have these information engines that are constantly stoking outrage. And I actually think outrage in some ways is the new religion. It's the new thing that gives people a sense of meaning. People find a way to like get outraged, and that way they have a sense that they're in the game and that they're not just, passive consumers. They're like actively engaged in some process of being angry about elites getting away with molesting women, or whatever the moral panic of the day is. Each one of those moments that people participate in that gives them a sense of meaning. The Chinese think that that's incredibly socially destructive, and so they savagely repress all that kind of action. And we're seeing a test in real time about which system is actually going to be able to produce a more stable society. I would say the jury's out on that. We don't yet know. In 10 years, we may have a better idea. I think if you look at the assessment of the last 10 years, I think the Chinese have probably had a more stable situation than we've had, certainly politically, in the United States or in Europe. But that's not the only dependent variable we want to be thinking about.
So, it's, I mean, again, Sam and I go back and forth on this, and it also boils down to, I think, like the frame of analysis. I think for Sam, like, you start sort of, maybe, again, you can correct Sam later, but like, the moral question is one of individual meaning and kind of like, the individual's relation to like a moral frame and the rest of this. I guess I approach it from like, the different direction. That's why, when we're talking about like religion earlier, and, however you sort of frame, is it religion around the planet, whether it's actually the dying religions of the past, Christianity, clearly not Islam across Europe, but I think that we're missing something, because that ends up still focusing on the individual and the meaning making for the individual. Now, again, like what is society but a collection of individuals? We have to tend to that, but I think that misses something, and that's why I'm coming back to this question of sovereignty fundamentally, because what we're talking about is how do you get things like done in a way, visibly. Um, Internationally as a unit, maybe not internationally, but how do you get stuff done as a unit in a way that motivates everyone in the unit to like lean into it? Ultimately is what it comes down to. The American dream, quite frankly, Christianity, religion, all of that in the American context has fed into it. I mean, like manifest destiny is like, it's a religious concept. It's, the Puritans are reading about New Jerusalem, and the way that like, the American project is fundamentally a religious project. The important motivating thing there is not what does religion fundamentally give to the individual in terms of morals. It's, does the individual get to participate in a truly large, meaningful story, and is willing to then lean into it. I think this is what the Europeans completely like, oh yes, it's, we're leaning into the moral story of redemption after the Holocaust. That's basically it. And we'll fill in the gaps through basically through economic stuff. I think like a weaker sense of that also has infected the Americans. Basically, we're living through, it comes much later, but we're the victors at the end of the Cold War. And now, we're just basically spreading prosperity. That was the 1990s actual vision. And it infected us with all the stuff you guys are talking about, Fukuyama as well. But what we've lost is a certain kind of, I think it's like vitality, vitalism, leadership, like drive of some sort. That doesn't just say, how do we restore religion and restore that on the level of the individuals, and then you have it, right? Like, I mean, you have non-sovereign entities, kind of like the Holy Roman Empire, which are quite frankly very much based around a religion, and yeah, they exist for centuries. But to say that they're sovereign and command that kind of, vitality is false. You have a bunch of princes underneath this, and it's a bureaucratic management system. It's not saying that these things are can't last or are unimportant, or like even that they're bad necessarily. But I think that like at least what I'm feeling right now in politics and this like rise of populism, this like craving for populism is like what people want is someone to get stuff like not just done, but done in a way that they can really get behind and like play a part in pushing. That's what like you see like what Zoran Mamdani has done is just like, he's activated people in a way. I think like the successful Democratic politician activates people. And I think that activation currently is populist because all the other stuff has fallen apart. Um, I don't know, make of that what you will, but that's like what I mean when I'm like talking about like sovereignty and as the thing that's missing. And I think like if we approach it as just in terms of a philosophical discussion about like let's repurpose ourselves on individual values, that doesn't solve the sovereignty problem. It feels like political sovereignty is what is driving politics today. The lack of it creates a vacuum and sucks in basically actors who want to be sovereign and are able to mobilize societies into sovereignty. Does that make sense?
It does. Let me say a couple of things about that. So, first of all, let's do a little bit of intellectual history on this. So, the concept of the individual that we have that structures social science, our political institutions, our small L liberal political institutions, basically emerges in the middle of the 17th century. Famously with Descartes, I think therefore I am, and the idea that the individual thinking mind is the unit of analysis that has political status and that has moral standing, right? And Descartes is very explicit. He separates off the human in this sense from animals, which are just purely instinct driven on the one hand, and machines on the other, which have mechanical capacity but cannot think. And so those two contradistinctions are what create the kind of modern conception of the individual, and it emerges there in the middle of the 17th century. It's taken in a very political direction by Hobbes. It's turned in the course of the 18th century, with Locke and Hume in a more scientific direction, and eventually that becomes the methodological individualism of the social sciences. So on the one hand, that emerges in the middle of the 17th century. The other thing that emerges in the middle of the 17th century, even more famously actually, is the concept of sovereignty that you're talking about here, coming out of the Treaty of Westphalia. This is a little bit of a retcon, I think, in political theory, because I'm not sure that the people who were signing that treaty in Westphalia in 1648 really had the concept of sovereignty the modern concept of sovereignty, where the monarch basically gets to define the totality of life. They were making very specific comment about, the right of the monarch to determine the religious life of his subjects. So they were making a more narrow point, but it was abstracted away from that particular case that was meant to end the 30 Years' War in Europe to a general principle. And I don't think it's at all a coincidence that the concept of individuality and individualism and the concept of sovereignty emerge at the same moment, because they're both in response to the rupture of specifically European Christianity with the Reformation, right? So that's kind of the system that emerges. And then there's a whole series of what we might call meta-narratives of the individual, meta-narratives of the nation, meta-narratives of industrialism, et cetera, that sort of emerged in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. So understanding the way those two things are linked historically to each other, I think is really important also for then understanding what happens in the 1990s. Because we were just talking about the sort of Fukuyaman, sort of cornucopian moment of the 1990s. But the other big key word of the 1990s, of course, is postmodernity and postmodernism. This starts out as some obscure French political theory, basically, in the 1960s and 70s. And by the 1990s, people are talking about, there's like postmodernism is being discussed on MTV, right? And the famous definition of postmodernism that the French philosopher Jean-François Lyotard proposes in the late 1970s is an incredulity towards meta-narratives, right? Like we just don't believe any of these big stories anymore. And there's a weird way in which, I'm sure somebody's written about this. I don't know that I've ever read anybody who's tried to really put these two things together, but there's a sense in which the Lyotardian incredulity towards meta-narratives actually dovetails really nicely with the Fukuyaman version of like, oh, we don't need meta-narratives anymore. We may miss them a little bit. It may be a sad time because we don't have the thymos to motivate us anymore. But the loss of that kind of propulsive larger story, I think, is another big part of what happens in the 1990s, right? And I think there's been a whole series of efforts over the last, the first quarter of this century to figure out what is the alternative meta narrative that can come in the wake of that. And there's certain kinds of leftists who remain committed to the postmodern incredulity that just reject that. We don't need that. I might fall into that category myself to a certain extent. Like, I don't personally feel a need for a really large meta narrative. I do feel like there's projects we need to take on because of, I do think personally climate change is potentially a catastrophic. I don't even think potentially. I think it's almost inevitably going to be a horribly catastrophic process for the quality of human life, quality of life of non-humans as well. But I'm not sure that I see it as in religious terms. But it's very, very evident that people, in a sense, have been forum shopping for different kinds of religions. Is it about, human rights? That was one kind of meta-narrative. I think that was really central for the Europeans in particular, and for certain kinds of liberals in the United States. Is it going to be about, a return to nation, family, church, God, children, etc.? That is, that's a more reactionary, if you want to put it that way. It's a sort of a more traditionalist view of what the meta-narrative can be, but that's certainly been enrolled as a meta-narrative because we need a meta-narrative. And I think the big question is, can we do without it? And if we can't, and I say we, the human totality, what are the alternatives that are available to us? And can we think of ones that are better and worse? And what is even the normative standards for judging those things? I'm not sure I have an answer.
Oh, let me just, Sam, before you jump in, I just want to push on one thing though, Nils. How do you convince people to just do politics around climate change if you don't have a meta narrative to sell them? Like and I mean, you were gesturing at it earlier, right? Like the religion about like the planet and that sort of thing. But like the essence of politics, the essence of whatchamacallit, of activation, of mobilization is that. And in the sense that, like, liberalism as an ideology has leached out any vitality out of these things is why liberalism's in trouble. And you need that kind of story to get a group of people to do it, not on the individual, on happiness. Like, those metrics are important, but are completely orthogonal to what I think is important in politics today. It's not personal meaning. It's not personal, things. I mean, I think all of those tap in, but it's how does a leader come up with a meta narrative that, rightly or wrongly, satisfies something in human beings in aggregate, not in individuals. That's, I guess, is part of where I'm getting at. So like on climate, apart from doing catastrophism and saying this is going to impact us all, maybe it's a religious thing that you say, then it's like, it is find in scripture where it says that we need to, actually take responsibility for these things as shepherds or something like that. But you still need a story. You need some kind of story to do it. And, if you don't, you're just politically inert is what it feels like.
Well, I think that's right. And let me just elaborate one dimension of that. So we talk about a meta narrative or a master narrative. What is the form that those things take? And I would argue that they always have a kind of a four-part structure. Once upon a time, then something happened, therefore we must, so we will get. Okay? And part of the genius of MAGA as a slogan, Make America Great Again, is in 4 words, Donald Trump managed to have all 4 of those categories
that's so funny. Yeah.
Named, right? And also left it vague so that people could fill in the blank with whatever they wanted. When was America great? The one thing we know is that the call to action is elect Donald Trump, right? But like, other than that, everything was kind of fungible. So I do think people do need a story of like, once upon a time, in the case of climate change, it would be something like once upon a time the climate was stable, then carbon-based industrialism happened. Therefore, we need to, which will destroy the world if we let it run away. Therefore, we must, enact a green tech transition so we can have a stabilized planet, right? So that could be a meta narrative that people could buy into. And then the question is, like, to your point, do people need to have, in order to buy that meta narrative, a even deeper set of commitments around, and by the way, there is a tradition in almost every scriptural tradition that I've looked at of reverence for the planet, reverence for Mother Earth, the idea that we need to have an ecological balance. You can find that in certainly in all the Abrahamic faiths, but really in all the animist faiths. I don't know, I'm not a scholar of religion particularly, but like every religious tradition I've ever seen, there is, in the same way there's a mystical tradition in almost every religious tradition, there is a, pro-earth tradition within each religious tradition, or most all religious traditions. So I think, if you need something deeper, that you need to be about deep ecology, about humans' fundamental, entwinement with all the animals and creatures that are around us, with the bacteria, with the multi-species assemblage that forms our bodies, right? Can you turn that into a religion? I don't personally feel the need to do that, but some people could, and this could be that if it found the right leader. That's a new kind of narrative, and it's not. A lot of people have tried, to promote that. Ranging in various. You have people giving Jeremiads, like the Swedish Girl. You have people who are, trying to do things in a friendlier way, like Bill McKibben. You have all sorts of people who are trying to do this. It hasn't really taken,
Yeah.
at least not outside leftist circles. What has taken, however, is nationalist narratives, right? Like, because I think there's more of a folk memory of what that looks like. Like, what is it? When was Hungary great? When was America great? And people can say it was great back when my grandparents were alive because it features X, Y, and Z. And they can, try to plausibly steer the ship back towards those cultural and social affordances of that prior era that they think, usually fictitiously, was a much better time.
The problem is is universal community. I feel like that doesn't have enough of a take. Like you need to be, uh, you can't be, we're a part of humanity and we're fighting humanity's worst instincts to make a better humanity. I think that just doesn't work as a political project for whatever reason. But Sam, you were going to jump in, and to
Yeah, I mean,
sharpen something.
I was going to push a little bit here. So I feel like the for me, the way that this seems to have developed is that I think there have always been extreme options below the surface. There was a period, I think there was a period in the initial part that you were talking about, like in the 17th and 18th centuries, where you get a certain level of post-trauma politics where people are like, okay, we're going to actually like work with this framework and allow it to be fairly homogenous and powerful. And then I think you have similar post-trauma politics post-World War II, where there's like a willingness to kind of capitulate to particular like whatever universals that are permitted to structure society for a certain period of time. I guess the thing is that it seems to me that a lot of liberals that I talk to just seem very unrealistic about how extreme the choices are there. So if you end up, and I think this is probably something that Demir and I agree about. Like, Demir, for you, it seems like your sense is not exactly like Nietzsche, but not that far away, which is that the large scale ideals seem hollow. And so you are at a certain level pushed back to a question of politics as will. And that can involve clever politicians telling large stories, but at the base there is just a baseline competition of will against will. I can say why I don't think that's the case, but Demir, is that an unfair characterization of how you think about, so like
I
the like pushing away the side of meta narratives for a second, like that there just is a kind of a default toward human violence that's very, very powerful.
I mean, yeah, I guess, but it's not. I guess I don't really identify so much with like the Nietzschean thing, just because he also seems to focus on the individual more than I'm really, I think, tempted to do here. It's more like, what is politics? I mean, that always ends up being. I mean, it's what Shadi and I largely have started this podcast, years ago, debating, and like the importance of politics. I don't know if we've gotten anywhere with it, but I do feel that there's something that, how do I put it? Successful politicians and successful political movements understand politics, and other moral causes that are trying to fill the void don't. I think that again, I think you're right, Sam, that there's something, in the shadow of a cataclysm that allows universalist faith like liberalism to flourish for a while. Also, however, you do have the United States as the hegemon of over the world at that point, and Americans, by and large, believe the meta narrative about America still, like the sort of the founding myth in a big way, and it's still inflected with, again, I think one would probably, I mean, I don't know the sociology of it when that sort of starts truly ebbing away, but through most of the 20th century and a good chunk of the Cold War, I think it is religiously inflected in the sort of like founding myths of America, like the American religious self-conception as part of a larger biblical story, to be like perfectly frank about it. And it's I think therefore I think we agree why liberalism has grown hollow, but it's, you know, again, not to put too fine a point on it. So many people critical about Zoran Mamdani. I don't like his politics necessarily, but you see the guy. From first clip I saw of the guy, I was like, this guy gets politics. He gets it. And it's not about his will to power, Sam, though it's obviously there, and we can talk about like what drives any individual politician, but that's not what's interesting about it. What's interesting is that he is able to connect people to something. And that's something.
He's got the skill.
It's a skill, but it's more than a skill. I mean, a person like that is a kind of prophet. And why? So, I mean, the question ends up being is why is the nice little Swedish Jeremiah girl an unsuccessful prophet? And why is Zoran Mamdani, at least right now, seems like a more successful prophet? Looking at the left more broadly.
Or the Antichrist, as Peter Thiel has taught us all.
Yeah. I don't know, Nils, what do you think?
Well, first of all, every prophet is somebody else's every prophet for one person is somebody else's antichrist, and in the same way that anybody who has a utopia, they're almost certainly describing somebody else's dystopia, and vice versa. So look, I think that I'm glad we haven't brought up Carl Schmitt. You two didn't bring up Carl Schmitt yet, but I'm going to
not even once. Not even once.
I saw in one of your recent Substacks, Nils, that you did, and I was very thrilled to see it. But I've been avoiding it this whole thing. I could have at any one point, but I didn't.
I think Demir did use the words "the concept of the political," so it's
we're getting close.
You provoked me. Look, I'm just not convinced by the basic Schmittian assertion that all politics is about the friend-enemy distinction. I just think that's, it's cynicism on stilts, and we don't have to believe that. What people like Mamdani or Trump or, or any other successful politician has is charisma, right? I mean, this is, Weber famously talked about charisma as one of the basic things that a successful politician, it's not the only way a politician can be successful. They can be successful with, technocratic competence, right? And also, charisma also attends to an office. It's not just an individual quality, right? I mean, I met Xi Jinping once, and I've never seen anybody, and I've met U.S. presidents and lots of other really powerful people, and nobody has ever exuded an aura of power like that guy. Not because he didn't speak English. I couldn't understand what he said. So it wasn't anything about like his command of media. It wasn't about his command of, a compelling oratory. It was literally just the pomp of being at Zhongnanhai and seeing the way all the Chinese sort of reacted to him as he entered the room, right? I mean, and that quality, I think.
It impresses Trump too, right? He said that about Xi Jinping. He's just like, that guy. He's
exactly,
like, he's got it, that guy. He's scared of him,
right?
Or at least he's impressed with him, not scared necessarily.
Yeah, and by the way, like, obviously that's partly about the office, but but Xi Jinping has it in a way that Hu Jintao did not, right? Or at least did not attempt to exercise that quality in the same public way that Xi Jinping has. So what that quality is always hard to pin down. I mean, you can put a label on it like charisma, but that doesn't really actually answer what that quality is. I do think we need charismatic leaders in a democratic society. If we're going to have, leaders have to be able to inspire people. And people as different as Trump and Obama, their characters could hardly be more different, but they both inspire their followers unbelievably strongly. At least Obama did for a while. Trump still continues to do so. So I think, do we have to have that kind of person as a leader? I think we probably do in a democratic society.
So this is where, this is now getting pretty close to the argument or dialectic that we often get into on this podcast, which is, so like on the three of us, like I'm the one who is religious. And I think my feeling about this whenever I'm talking to people who don't have a primary religious commitment, but do have like moral visions that they want to pay attention to here, is that at the end of the day, there is just a what is real type question, and that isn't actually able to be just diluted away. So like, it's amazing how frequently I meet people, actually both in, like right now I'm in San Francisco, here that kind of like we can engineer society kind of mindset, and DC both have that extremely strongly. And every time every time I get immersed in one of those conversations, I always think like, this is someone who's like one step away from, like, I mean, they are human, but they're one step away from inhabiting that primary human force, which is just, I want to know what's real. What is the nature of the world? How does it work? What does it mean to live a good life? How do you actually understand the moral stakes of something? And I do feel like part of the reason that Democrats are not doing very well right now is that there's a whole generation of people that were taught to think about society in that kind of engineer mindset. Whereas at the end of the day, like, and this is where I think that the clash of politics involves a real set of divergences. It's like, what is actually the case, and how does that translate into how we live, what it means to live well. And I think part of what's going on now is that the there's like a kind of almost asymmetric battle happening, and it's like we're trying to clash at that kind of level, and the skill set is just not there in a primary way. Demir, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, look, yeah, sure. I just say, in at least like Christianity, there's still plenty of room to not know God's will is the main thing. And so, I'm always struck by these invocations of like, the good life. I still think that doesn't get you out of the politics question. And maybe charisma, as you're saying, Nils, is just all we're talking about, so it's a lot less interesting than it might be. But it seems to me that it's I don't know how to put it. Politics is still at the core of it, and
No, but
mobilizing people is still what it's all about. Now, whether the ultimate ends and the rest of that, I mean, again, that's not for any of us to judge. Ultimately, even in the most religious frame,
right,
you don't get to make that call.
But my point is that like what it is that exercises like what gets the blood pumping is arguments about what's real. Like so like if you're going to do politics, getting to yourself to the point where you're able to ask about questions about what's real at a very fundamental level seems to me that like that's an essential. And then, to Nils, to your point about climate. So what I see in that area, because like it is an area I care a lot about, is that the issue is not, can we convince people that maybe the planet's doing poorly? You could probably convince people of that. Who knows? Can you convince people that like if we wanted to deal with this, that it would involve a lot of sacrifice? Probably. The issue is more at the fundamental motivation level, which is like, why love this enough that you're going to make significant sacrifices in order to make sure that this is cared for? And like the degree to which the climate people go to like just enlightened self-interest, like, hey, your town is also going to burn, and like whatever, that's fine. But I think it's right at this same like Nietzschean level that we're talking about, which is like, why love something enough that you're going to make immediate real sacrifices that are against your proximate interests, but somehow have this longer horizon. I think that the only things that seem to motivate that are like larger visions of the good. And like we do have real instances of human communities making real sacrifices after like generation after generation, but they're almost never motivated just by a kind of like individualist view. It has to have some large like genuine framework. And I think we're just not very, like, we don't see many instances of people who can tell stories that are compelling on that like generational timescale.
I'm not sure I totally agree with that. Actually,
Okay.
I think that there are a lot of stories that people tell that are long term. Since you brought up my Substack earlier, Demir, I'll shamelessly plug something I wrote last week. That there are sort of two competing. There are meta narratives about doom that humanity is facing, one on the left and one on the right. The one on the left we've been talking about, which is climate change. And so, and that story is about a long-term story. I mean, climate change is not going to destroy civilization or even Miami tomorrow, right? But if you wait 100 years, it's going to be potentially really, really, really dire, right? The story on the right is about demographic implosion, right? Which is also a long-term thing. And it's not something that you as an individual can do very much about. I mean, if I decide to have 3 babies instead of 2, I'm not making much of a dent, right, in the larger story about, falling birth rates all over the world, right? Even if Elon Musk decides to have 50 kids, he's still not making personally a dent in that problem. And so, but these are both long-term stories that are motivating of people, and that have all sorts of ramifying implications for how do we think about resource allocation? How do we think about family policy? How do we think about infrastructure investments? I mean, there are if you believe either one of those narratives, there are really big implications of sacrifices that need to be made in the present. And I think that both of them, a lot of people do find compelling. So I'm not sure that it's that people don't believe in that stuff. I want to make one more point before I hand it back to you guys on this, which is something else you brought up earlier. I do think that people need to have a shared vision of the future. And I mean, this is also something, Demir, I think you published a piece of mine about this a long time ago, where I talked about, the official future, right? And that any group of people, in order to be able to engage in collective action, have to believe certain shared things about the future. So if the 3 of us wanted to start a company together, we would have to believe something about the nature of the industry we're going into, about our ability to raise finance and capital, our ability to attract employees, our ability to find, product market fit. All of those things would be things we would have to have a shared story about, right? Or if you're a couple, you have to have a shared story about how you're going to get old together and, raise kids together, or whatever it is you do as a couple, right? You have to have a shared story. When couples break up, when companies go bankrupt, you don't need to have the same shared story anymore about what that was about. Now you can each have your own narrative. And so I think part of the reason why people like national stories is it gets everybody on the same page, right? It says we all have a shared national story. And this is one way in which I think that the right in the United States, if we want to get to the cultural politics of this, has gotten something fundamentally, an intuition that's correct, is that the fragmentation of the American story has led to a fragmentation of the capacity to engage in collective action, right?
That's so good.
And so there's been some effort. There's been some effort on the part of people like Nikki Hannah-Jones with her 1619 project to create an alternative master narrative for the United States rooted in Afro-pessimism. But these ideas are like totally outside the mainstream. I mean, we don't even have to have an argument about whether they're correct or not. Like, they are clearly very minoritarian perspectives that you're just not going to be able to get wide-scale purchase on. And in the meanwhile, we get a fragmentation. We have the 1619 project, and then we have Trump's 1776 project, and we don't have a shared project. And that, to me, that lack of a shared future because we lack a shared past, that's a catastrophe for collective action.
So, we're already on an hour here, so we should probably start wrapping. But let me just throw one more to both of you, because you said something there, Nils, which just on Nicole Hannah-Jones' project, and you said we don't have to debate whether it's true. And Sam, this is my answer to, I think, a lot of this stuff. I think the question of the truth.
Finally, I've been waiting for 4 years.
Shut up! The thing about the question of the truth, ultimately, I think that's a question for the individual, and the individual facing the ultimate questions. In politics, I'm not sure those matter. I'm not sure that those ultimately matter the question of the truth. It's because, like, in politics is really what can you get done. Now, I think, look, Weber does a really good thing about, the ethic of responsibility. Like, you need to have that as part of a successful politics to get things done. You can't just be, the worst kind of tyrant and still live a life of luxury and, whatever, and not fail necessarily within a lifetime. And so, I guess the question on the level of the leader, on the level of the leader, you might have, these questions that do matter. But I think it's a matter of getting things done. And this is why it's a question for the left, fundamentally, is how are you going to do it? Why is the climate thing, you both have said, you're both climate people, and you want climate to be a political thing. Why are you failing? Why are you failing? And the question is not, the society is not grappling with the real. I don't think it is. I think you're just not telling a good story.
We're clearly not telling good enough a story. That's for sure. I mean, I published a book last year where I tried to tell a better story. So, we'll see. I think that it's but I agree with you. We gotta have a shared story. Look, the other thing about sort of thinking about master narratives, right, is in any country, any community, there's a million stories, right? And what creates a community is that there's some shared stories that are touchstones and touch points that people share, right? That these are the important stories that we retell, right? We're going to tell, whether it's as cheesy as, George Washington being such a truth teller that he wouldn't, he couldn't chop down the cherry tree, which everybody, it was the reason why that's such a famous, like, kind of incident in American historiography, if you want to call folk historiography, is precisely because it's a ridiculous story. Everybody knows it's a ridiculous story, and yet it's a worthwhile story that we tell about George Washington because we want to believe this about George Washington. And it's important that our first president be a kind of secular saint, a secular saint that was so good that even as a small child, he couldn't tell a lie about chopping down a cherry tree. I mean, it's a ridiculous story. I don't think anybody's ever believed it, right? And yet, why do we retell it? Why do you guys know it? It's because it's an important shared story for us to have. And I think that those kinds of shared stories are really important. And, one of the things I'm disappointed by is like the 250th, bisesquicentennial, is that what it's called? It's coming up
Mm,
next year.
yeah,
Would have been an opportunity potentially for a unifying story around this, but you can just, given who's president, you can be sure it's just going to be
yeah,
a cause for division, strife, and so on. And there's a
totally.
lot of people who profit off of that division and strife, including the president himself. And that makes it really hard for us to have collective projects, and that's a real bummer. I don't know what,
But
what else to
so
say.
just to push this slightly though, so like on that thing that you're saying, Demir. So I mean, I think in short-term timescales, you can have very, very adept politicians who can tell false stories and build huge political momentum around them. Totally makes sense. But I don't think that it then follows from there that truth has no relevance to politics. I think it's just that the time scale catches up with you more slowly. So like take the climate thing. If it's the case that like the climate's fine and we'll be okay, that will catch up with like all of the people who like have been saying like doomerism, blah 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 blah. And like if the climate turns out in whatever 100 years, that stuff, like those people, and say those people got into power and did a whole bunch of things, it might be like COVID where like people are really angry about creating false paranoia around something. I think it's similar with the kind of individualism versus community thing where, and actually, I mean, with the climate, it's obviously also the inverse where like if you have a bunch of regimes that totally ignore the climate stuff and then climate ends up being totally catastrophic, that does catch up with your politics eventually. There's like an empirical check at that point. Similarly with individualism versus community. So like if you build a society that's like set around individual, like whatever, meritocratic thriving, that can like survive for a while if it's the case that humans don't need some of these other meaning structures. In contrast, if like I think this is what we're seeing, that individualism paradigm from the 90s, like actually was not an adequate understanding of basic anthropology at a real level. And so then what you get is like a political blowback that has all kinds of features to it.
I just think, for me, it's not individualism that blew up the '90s. It's belief in other sort of dumb transcendent things that don't pan out. But it's look. I just say on the sort of like truth claim in politics on climate. I think it's astute that you bring up COVID because ultimately politics. And like truth ultimately is it's a nasty business. And ultimately, again, if you get into like what is the real and what is true on a historical timeline, uh these are claims that you're going to be making, providential claims, if you will, which again I think in earlier times, like the will of God played that sort of role for people. It's like God wills this on the longer time. But on the role that we can play politics on any one of these things, imagine that like you successfully convinced people that climate is a catastrophe and you got a global government that then basically made people do all the degrowth strategies because degrowth will perhaps save the planet. And do you think that once the planet is saved, these people will be heralded as heroes? No, they will be thrown into the ditch and murdered. You know what I mean? Because they made life terrible. And gets down to the thing, like, what is it? How do you legitimize yourself? Not like, what is the real? In the real world was a perfectly argument to be made that in fact they were acting in the real world as, you know, martyrs and all this. And then, okay, well, we can even say their martyrdom was worthwhile, and societies like rebelled against this. But I guess I'm just interested in like basically how you do politics and the importance of doing politics in these things. I think those are really important questions. Yeah. Nils?
So what you're pointing out is a really serious problem for anybody who wants to engage in policy practices that are basically about trying to prevent bad things from happening.
Mm.
Because and whether that's nuclear war that you're trying to prevent from happening, or a genocide that you're trying to prevent from happening, or runaway climate change that you're trying to prevent from happening, insofar as you're successful, you will be seen in retrospect as having been a Cassandra who forced all this expenditure and suffering to take place in order to prevent something that wasn't going to have happened anyways.
Yep.
And this is a well-known paradox in policy studies, and I don't know that there's a solution to that. I do think charismatic figures have been able to draw people towards those kinds of policy goals, but it's really hard to sustain that over time for exactly the reasons you say. And it's, as I say, it's not an unusual paradox, right? I mean, so if you want to talk about the pandemic for a second, look, what happened with the pandemic? What happened with the pandemic was when it broke out in China, everybody saw the crazed reaction the Chinese had domestically inside their country. People in full hazmat suits locking neighborhoods down. That was the initial thing. Then the next thing that happened was we saw the horrible images coming out of northern Italy and New York City, right, of mass graves, and it was just terrible. And so the natural reaction of policymakers was to pull out every tool they had, close the borders, which was useless, except in very, very remote islands, right? Because the virus doesn't care about our borders. But we retreated to the national, we retreated to the sovereign uselessly. And then we engaged in lockdowns that often lasted way too long. I mean, I think in retrospect, we can see that probably the right answer would have been to have a lockdown until vaccines became available. And then once everybody had access, who wanted to have access to a vaccine, could have access to a vaccine, open things back up, right? That probably would have been the right, with hindsight, but we didn't know. Remember when the virus first came out, we weren't supposed to shake hands because we thought it might be transmitted that way, right? There was a fundamental disjuncture between the scientific knowledge of this thing and what we had to do from a policymaking perspective. And this gets to something which I think would be a great thing for you guys to explore in other podcasts with people who are bigger experts on this than me. But there's also a fundamental divergence in the logic of science and the logic of politics. The logic of science is about hypothesis, collect data, test your hypothesis, revise it. You're always uncertain. There's never final truth. You're always trying to get a more and more accurate description of reality. In politics, especially if you have to make a tough decision that's going to make some of your constituents suffer, you have to be absolutely certain. You have to express certainty. And you saw this tension constantly between Trump and Fauci, where Fauci was saying, well, the best we can do is this, best estimate is this. And Trump was saying, well, can we really judge these things properly, right? Because Trump understands politics very well, that in order to make these really tough decisions, you have to get out there with force, and with the source of the charisma is the confidence. One of the sources of the charisma is the confidence of your judgment. And there's just a fundamentally divergence between the logic of science from that perspective and the logic of politics from that perspective. And the backlash against science and expertise, which has followed on the pandemic in the United States above all, but really all over the world, is a result of that tension between those two things, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. Sam, do you have a final parting word so we don't go out spinning off on a whole nother?
We'll title this podcast "The Left Finally Has a Solution to its political weakness." So that's good.
Okay. Good.
I think we really did resolve
I think
everything.
you're overselling this conversation maybe a little bit.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. But that's how we write headlines in the news.
that's politics.
Exactly.
Nils, it's so good to see you. This has been genuinely delightful. It'll be fun to to pick these things up. Demir, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you guys for having me on.